Hey, so last night I was watching this film, Welcome to Sarajevo. It's a 1997 British film directed by Michael Winterbottom, and basically, it is a semi-fictional story of a group of journalists in besieged Sarajevo during the Bosnian War in the early 1990s, and there's a particular focus on a journalist called Michael Henderson, played by Stephen Delane. Now, Michael Henderson is based on a real life journalist, Michael Nicholson. And as something of a strange coincidence, as I was watching this film, and I often do research as I'm watching films, I may have seen it before, but I discovered that Michael Nicholson actually passed away last week at 79. So that was a bit of a coincidence. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about that. Then I want to talk about a contemporary conflict, Syria, of course. Um, which has many parallels to Bosnia, but I'll get onto that in a minute. Firstly, just a little bit about Michael Nicholson. Like I say, the film is semi-fictional insofar as the fictional characters and the exact storyline is somewhat fictional, but otherwise it's a war drama. It's a very powerful war drama, I might add. Um, and it basically shows in some way what life was like in Sarajevo at that time, the constant battle for survival that citizens and journalists had to put up with, especially citizens. Um, I saw a picture of a cemetery in Sarajevo, and it's quite poignant seeing hundreds and hundreds of white pointed headstones. Um, but anyway, Michael Nicholson was described by Sir Trevor MacDonald as the finest journalist of his generation. He was in many frontline conflicts. He was in Saigon during its fall in 1975. He was the first foreign journalist to interview Robert Mugabe. He was reporting in the first Gulf War, and he was reporting in the Bosnian War, where he was based in Sarajevo. And that's what the film was loosely based on. And during that, he came across an orphanage with 200 orphans, and along with an American aid worker, he helped to uh, smuggle some of them out. And one of them, a young girl called Natasha, he he told the authorities that she was his daughter. When he arrived at Heathrow Airport, he helped to get the orphans handed in to the immigration authorities. At the time, that was criticised both by journalists and the Bosnian authorities. It was a very audacious move, almost a Schindler's List type move. But nevertheless, Michael Nicholson was a highly respected journalist, and yeah, incidentally, he ended up adopting Natasha, and she's now settled in the UK. But it got me thinking, and this is a good film that really shows what frontline journalism is like. In fact, this is probably the film that, because I've seen it several times, that got me interested in journalism. That's actually the course I took at university. Well, my life didn't quite go down that path, and sometimes I have regret for that because I always wanted to be a frontline journalist. I always wanted to be part of history. Perhaps that's why I collect newspapers today. But one thing we should remember is that, the media gets criticized very heavily, and a lot of that's legitimate criticism. I've certainly not been shy of the problem I think that lies in media bias and, you know, political agendas and all the rest of it. But we shouldn't lose the sight of the fact that there are frontline journalists from all networks who really do take serious risks on the ground, and it's a very dangerous job, frontline reporting. And these people often suffer the same post-traumatic stress as soldiers, not surprisingly. And unlike soldiers, they don't have weapons to defend themselves. So, whilst criticism of big networks is often valid, I think we should respect those frontline journalists, and Michael Nicholson was living testimony to that. Anyway, I wanted to speak a little bit about Syria. It is a defining conflict of our age, and I think there is a lot of inevitable parallels to Bosnia. It's a lot worse at the moment, and that's not just hyperbole. even Bosnians who were living in Aleppo have said that it is even worse than Sarajevo. The conflict in Syria estimates are anything from 300,000 to 470,000 dead. Um, the figures for Bosnia are most sources now cited to be about 100,000. Both terrible conflicts, but Sarajevo 1995, Aleppo 2016. Homs and Damascus have seen some very heavy fighting as well, but Aleppo, it just, the city is like Gomorrah or Sodom. And I'm just saying that in terms of destruction. It's just like nothing left. And the tragedy of this is obviously the human tragedy, but the fact that it's one of the world's oldest cities, and in 9 millenniums or 7 millenniums, it hasn't seen anything like this. So it's a complete human tragedy, and there is a sense of frustration, I think, for the rest of the world. I will say one thing that annoys me a little bit is when people say that the world doesn't care, leaders don't care, but no one actually has an answer as to what should be done. Very few people have an answer. So the only thing the only reason that annoys me is it's all very well to say, oh, they don't care. But you know, in the end of the day, it's diplomats like John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov who who are involved in these very complex situations now. I'm not saying there isn't legitimate criticism, but I think it's a bit unfair to say that leaders aren't doing anything. It's just that what they're doing may not be what everyone thinks is the right thing to do. But I think it's nonsense to say that nothing is being done. That's hyperbole. But clearly, for the people of Aleppo, there's no comfort from good intentions or um, it will be interesting to see what approach Rex Tillerson takes as the new U.S. Defense Secretary, excuse me, Secretary of State. He's obviously very close to Russia, so perhaps, and I'm saying this as a big critic of the Putin regime, perhaps that could be something good in terms of Syria, because if the world's two big powers see eye to eye on this, maybe there could be final closure. Well, I think one of the biggest tragedies about Syria, and I'm not going to go into big details with this because I have mentioned it in other videos, is that everyone knows what vicious, sadistic, brutal organizations the likes of ISIS are. You know, it doesn't need to be, everyone knows that. But I think for me, one of the big tragedies of this is that because people have focused so much on the Islamist thugs who are fighting Assad, Assad has virtually been exonerated. Now, it seems that what has happened recently is that the regime have basically retaken Aleppo. But this narrative that the Assad regime are the good guys and everyone fighting them is the bad guys is far too simplistic. Syria is a very complex situation. And the fact of the matter is there's been brutality on both sides. Anyone who wants to exonerate the Assad administration are either useful idiots or they're loyalists to the regime. But the fact of the matter is, when this thing began, it was the Assad regime, a dictatorship, that used brute force to crush legitimate protests. People were protesting about unemployment, about corruption, about human rights abuses. They weren't Islamists. Syria was a pluralistic society. The Islamists just took advantage of the situation. But I could talk for ages about my opinions about the war. I can pontificate and say I believe this, I believe that. In the end of the day, a lot of people are going to disagree with me, and a lot of people are going to agree with me. It really doesn't matter anymore. The finger pointing. The only thing that matters is this mess coming to an end. And I think the only way that's going to happen, and this might sound like kind of an obvious, but the only way it's going to end is for the fighting to end. Because that is the only way that any country can start to rebuild. And it's going to take decades for Syria to rebuild. Never mind reconciliation. It's got to take decades just for the practical rebuilding structurally. Um, at this point, I would say probably the Assad side is, with Russian aid, is on the winning side. Um, but the truth is, nobody really, really can say for sure what the right answer for Syria is, because those who say, "Oh, it's great that Assad's winning," are ignoring the fact that there's many, many Syrians do not want Assad as a president. Um, so that could just trigger the situation for another war. I think that one way this would end is for arms to be cut off, and that takes the big powers, Russia, the US, and other powers, to basically cut off. It's like Syria is a fire, and people keep on putting more coals, more coals, more coals. And I'm not so naive to think that the arms trade is going to end tomorrow, but I think if there was a high level agreement between Moscow, Paris, London, Washington to say, look, this has to end. Let's have a mutual agreement to at least temporarily cut off all arms. So the West temporarily says, okay, we're not going to send any arms to Syria at all. Then Russia, for its part, should stop arming the Assad regime. It is the only way that I can see that this is going to end, because it continues, because it's a quagmire. So one side gets advantage, that gives them the momentum, but then there's setbacks. At the moment, I would say probably the Assad side is winning militarily, but there's no way that the likes of ISIS are going to just give up. So I can't see this ending unless things are cut off. Now, I think when people say the West created and funds ISIS, that's a very sweeping statement. You know, I'm yet to see anyone actually produce evidence that that is a policy position. Certainly, the West has sent arms into Syria to arm rebels who were determined to be moderate, and I think probably what happened is at some point the moderates got replaced by the more extreme elements, and then the likes of ISIS got the weapons. That is not the same as funding ISIS as a policy matter. Um, but there's other powerful countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia have to stop playing their sectarian games with the people of Syria, because that is what is fueling this, along with the arms trade. The prospect of a no-fly zone. There's another point I would make about Syria is it is so difficult to determine exactly what is happening there, because this has become a media war. If it wasn't already, it absolutely is a media war. So both sides have now got so fixed on their, and by both sides I mean whether you believe it's a case of Assad is the good guy fighting terrorists, or whether you believe that Assad is just as bad as a terrorist, as I do. And whatever position you take, it is so difficult to determine what is the truth, because pretty much every source is biased um, on some level. And I even have skepticism over independent journalists, notwithstanding what I said about my respect for frontline journalists. But the problem I have with some independent journalists is they purport to be independent. Then what do? They go and pander to Russian state media. They do interviews on RT, which, as far as I'm concerned, just makes it look like they're towing the line of Moscow. Um, so we'll hear one thing 1 hour, and then something at like the next hour. So, for instance, civilians are fleeing Aleppo. The next hour you'll hear, oh, they're not really civilians. Or there's just so much information going around about Syria. It's very, very difficult to know what to believe anymore. And frankly, it's very difficult to know what the right approach is. I would say, though, it is unfair and wrong to say that the West doesn't care or that nothing has been done. David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, pushed hard for action against both Assad and ISIS. Um, so people can't say that nothing was attempted. Um, this is a repeat of Bosnia insofar as there's a lot of similarities in the sort of urban nature of the war, in the refugee crisis, and in the sheer brutality of it. Um, Anyway, I'm going to round this up, but because this is such an important event, because it is such a big conflict, because it's created such a geopolitical situation in terms of refugees. And yeah, I do think that there are legitimate refugees out there, even if they're economic migrants. I do believe there are many legitimate refugees. But because of that, anybody who has any notion of interest in current affairs feels that they have to be on one side or the other. I don't think it's that simple. It's I'm not on the side of those fighting Assad, and I'm not on the side of Assad because I honestly believe that there is being brutality on both sides, and I just don't think anyone can make this conflict so simple because it is not. So I get really fed up when I see people say things like, "Oh, the West started this war because they're funding ISIS and Russia are the good guys coming in and saving Syria." Give me a break. And the other argument isn't so simple either. There are Islamist thugs on the ground. Um, so all I would say about Syria is people shouldn't assume this is a simple situation. It isn't. And I know it's a popular thing to say, "Oh, nobody cares," but I don't think it's so much that people don't care. I think it's that no one knows what to do. Because a lot of people say, "This is terrible. Why does the world not do anything?" But no one asks the follow-up question, what should the world do exactly? If it's a case of helping refugees, I think there's a very strong argument for that. Why has Russia helped no refugees? Why have the Gulf states helped no refugees? I think a lot more pressure should be put on them. But I wonder in 2026, 2036, 2046, 2056, 2066, is Syria going to be, is this horrible war going to be a distant, painful memory, or is it going to be now a situation where it's an ongoing sectarian nightmare similar to Iraq? And, I think the analogies to Bosnia are more similar to Iraq because Iraq was started over Western intervention. With Syria, it began over the protest back in 2010, part of the Arab Spring. Assad used force. Let's be clear, there was no Western invasion of Syria. So in that sense, it's different from Iraq. Anyway, I'll leave it there. That's just a few of my thoughts on the situation. And the truth is, I can talk about my opinions all day. I just don't know. And most of the people who comment on this don't know. Even the Syrians, although they obviously have first-hand experience, even they are going to be either in a regime held area or a rebel held area. So they're also going to be subject to propaganda of sorts, except they're living through the hell and living through the dangers of it. So the truth is, no one knows. And, I don't envy John Kerry. I don't envy Sergei Lavrov. These guys have an incredibly difficult job. Um, and I'm not saying they're innocent. I'm not saying that they're not culpable. And, it is their responsibility. But when people say no one cares, the follow up has to be, well, okay, what do you propose? And I'll leave it there. I just hope a year from now the situation is somehow better. And I don't know what form that is going to take. 2 years, 5 years from now, I just don't know. And we'll see how history develops. But at the very least, we should think about the people of Aleppo and show humanitarian compassion. Forget all of finger pointing. Just, I think where there are legitimate refugees, there is a moral duty to help them. I do believe that. And by the way, a lot of Syrians, we hear a lot of negative things about migrants, but a lot of Syrian refugees have actually given back to their host countries. We have flooding in northern England. Well, Syrian refugees actually helped build flood defences because they wanted to show that they were giving back to society. I'll leave it there.